clearer than ever that operating and succeeding in the open is no longer an option, but a necessity. And each day, new capabilities become available to achieve this. So I want to thank you all for being here with us today as you walk off stage. And I'd like to welcome on our second group of distinguished speakers who will examine achieving transparency, the evolution of intelligence. So joining us on the stage, we have Susan Gordon, Deputy Director, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. We have the Honorable Robert Litt, DNI General Counsel. We have Rear Admiral Kevin Lunde, Director, Exercises and Training, U.S. Cyber Command. We have Sean Nolan, Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And we have Doug Wise, Deputy Director of DIA. Keeping us moving, trying to keep us on schedule. Moderating this panel is Suzanne Kelly. She's the founder and CEO of the Cipher Brief. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, and Suzanne Kelly.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'm so privileged to have been asked to be on this stage with this incredible panel this afternoon. So thank you very much for the invitation as well. Talking about the issue of transparency has been a little bit tricky within the intelligence community, which by its nature is not intended or wasn't created to be transparent. So I think we have a great diversity of perspectives on how different agencies and organizations are tackling the issue of how do we tell people what we're doing without giving away too much information, right? So that's the core of what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to talk about the different ways that we're doing that. Everyone's already been introduced. A couple of interesting points. I guess I could, well, we've already talked about Sue Gordon's 25 years at the CIA before she joined NGA. She was also the senior director or the senior advisor to the director for cyber issues. Mr. Robert Litt was obviously now general counsel at ODNI. He was before this a partner with Arnold and Porter. Also a member of the governing body of the American Bar Association's criminal justice section, which may find a way into the conversation today. Rear Admiral Kevin Lunde, a director of Cyber Command Exercises and Training, Coast Guard. Served as commanding officer of the Coast Guard as well for the Intelligence Fusion Center Atlantic. And when you were there, you drove intelligence collection and analysis for the Coast Guard, correct? So that'll be an interesting point as well we can bring up. Mr. Doug Wise, Deputy Director, Defense Intelligence Agency, on joint duty assignment from the CIA. That'll be fun to talk about. Your first appearance in public, given that most of your life you have been in the shadows. And now you're going to be asked a bunch of questions about coming out of the shadows and how much information you should be giving. And then Mr. Sean Nolan, adjunct professor here at Georgetown, also an intelligence analyst at the CIA, and a big fan of Enigma, right? He's got these great cufflinks. And then, Mr. Wise, your tie. Should we talk about that now and just get it out of the way? I would love to. I think that's a perfect, actually, launching point, because your personal story is almost, in a way, a good analogy for the evolution of intelligence and how we now need to be transparent. And you have a fun little story about your tie to tell. Go ahead.
Excellent. I'll take that as an opportunity. First, thanks for chairing the panel. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. I've been about 1 year as Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency on joint duty assignment, which means I'm still employed by CIA and duty at DIA. I was 27 years undercover with the Director of Operations at CIA, so as the moderator said, this is my first public appearance, so I'm still going through the adaptation process. I've had a, is this on? Does this help? Is this better? Okay. Wow, I'm just out from the shadows and I'm already got a microphone in my hand. And I wore this, to the point, I wore this tie for this occasion, which happens to be a Rocky and Bullwinkle tie, which has Boris and Natasha on it. I thought it was quite apropos. So 27 years undercover, and so my presence here today is is a real tangible example of one small example of the openness and transparency that we now enjoy. And it was something that would not have been possible as short as 5-10 years ago, to have a former officer of the clandestine service sitting before you with members of the media and truly in the public domain. So my presence is a great example of the transparency that the President and Jim Clapper, the DNI, have asked us to enjoy, to say the least. If you like, since I have the floor, a little bit about my background. How did I get to CIA? I was a farm kid, went to West Point, had an opportunity to serve in the Special Operations community of the Army, and then further detailed off to the NRO and then to CIA. Had the opportunity to serve overseas, 11 tours. I was the chief of station 4 times, and had an opportunity to serve with the remarkable women and men of the intelligence community in a number of war zone environments, which is quite demanding, as you can imagine. As I mentioned, I came to DIA about a year ago from John Brennan's staff, doing a program management tour for him there. And I had the honor and the pleasure of joining Vince Stewart, who will be on later this afternoon, when he and I came in at about the same time as the front office leadership of the agency. I have the honor and the pleasure of working with a remarkable DIA team of professionals, women and men, quite frankly, globally deployed, 140 countries worldwide, nearly 20,000 of your colleagues of all walks of life, of all disciplines, that are serving, often in harm's way, in defense of your freedoms and defense of the United States of America. I might say that for any of you that would be interested, I'm going to take this opportunity shamelessly to recruit for DIA. If you'd like, I can talk about the transparency issue, or I can allow the rest of it.
I would like to get into sort of how the new transparency initiatives, right, are impacting particularly DIA, and maybe we can give each of the panelists an opportunity to talk about that. Why don't you lead us off on that?
Okay, just very quickly, thank you very much. Obviously, back in the old days, and I think more traditionally, as you alluded to, in the intelligence community, we were fairly closed-mouthed, very circumspect, and quite frankly, very guarded. And so there was no transparency, and it was very normal for the time. The culture of the United States allowed that. The legal framework of the United States allowed that. And certainly, from our standpoint inside the intelligence community, it made great common sense. So, since that time, the President and Director Clapper have been very clear. Transparency is an important aspect of life as an intelligence officer now, as much as the way we collect intelligence and the way we do intelligence business. It's an attribute of the intelligence profession now that is on par with the other elements of tradecraft, and I think that ethos has been well established. We're still adapting. We're not perfect at it, as I'm sure many of you would agree, but fundamentally, we've come a long way, quite frankly. I think it's obvious to most, why would we have been quite circumspect? I think it's to protect a couple things. One, it's to protect our capabilities, and it's also to be able to protect our activities, and quite frankly, to keep some additional information away from our adversaries. It's not surprising to any of us in this room and to any American citizen that, quite frankly, our adversaries are aggressive in targeting not just those of us on the stage and our colleagues, but you and the institutions you work for as well. And so their ability to put together secret information with information provided via the transparency mechanism, allows them to learn a little bit more about you and me and about the capabilities and activities of our nation. So it is important. But that said, the President and the DNI were very clear. The old ways of doing business, which was to shield everything not only from adversaries, but for our own citizenry, they discovered that, quite frankly, in today's world, isn't going to be helpful. It's not going to be helpful to you, and it's not going to be helpful for the intelligence community and the professionals in it. And so it was very clear that we were given the mandate to do what we can, and my colleagues can talk more about it than I can, in terms of being more transparent with the American citizenry. And I think it's, quite frankly, very obvious. Hard for me to adjust as a clandestine officer, I have to admit. But fundamentally, to correct misperceptions that exist about the intelligence community, I think there are many. I hold a few myself, actually. To understand the role of intelligence, to understand where intelligence fits in to the policymaker. Where does intelligence fit in the case of my agency, to supporting the combatant commander in taking the fight to the enemy, to winning on the battlefield and making it safer for the women and men who are serving in harm's way. I think it's also important for the American citizen to understand the strengths and limitations of the intelligence community, and also to understand the limitations of transparency as well. And I think it's equally important, and my colleagues will certainly talk about this, the powerful role of oversight of the intelligence community provided through the mechanism of our congressional oversight process. And I think all of us up here on the stage are committed, fully committed, and embrace the concept of congressional oversight. And of course, the issue of privacy protections also is something that is very important to you, to me. I'm a citizen as well. And the fact of the matter is, the more transparent, the more knowledgeable, the more insight that the American citizens can have, perhaps the less apprehension. But again, as I said, and I'll be quiet here, there is a cost to transparency. It's not an existential cost, but our adversaries are collecting against us. They are acquiring dots. They are doing data aggregation. They are recruiting spies. They are collecting on us, on you, on our economics, on our government, on our national security, our military, our intelligence infrastructure. And so their ability, when we go through the necessary and very appropriate elements of transparency, that's some additional dots for them and maybe some small bits of context that might make them better able to do some conclusions drawing about the United States plans, intentions, and capability. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity.
I think that's a fantastic setup. Thank you very much for those comments. Mr. Nolan, you're currently with the CIA as well and have been an analyst there and have spent decades at the agency. How has the CIA adapted to this idea of transparency all of a sudden, letting people know without, of course, divulging sources and methods? Let me just real quickly recap sort of what some of those principles include that the ODNI has published, and Mr. Litt can talk about this as well. But the idea of the transparency mission is to enhance public understanding, more or less, of what the IC does. It doesn't mean we're going to divulge sources and methods, but we're going to tell you why we're doing certain things that we're doing in a broader scale. How has the CIA in particular adapted to those transparency missions?
Right. Well, a little bit about my background is I'm an analyst, and by training, I'm an analytic methodologist. And so I try to consider, for coming into this talk, what kind of a method would we use to consider how open is too open, how secret is too secret, right? And so one of the things that occurred to me was a study, a kind of a novel study that was done a couple of years ago about social network analysis on Broadway, kind of like the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. And they evaluated the social network structure of the Broadway community and evaluated a statistic to see the degree to which a certain social network statistic would result in the probability of a flop. And so I think that we can learn from that a little bit, because...
So you're applying the Broadway study to the IC, saying how much is too much, right?
Exactly. So when you consider secrecy, secrecy is, I think, manifested oftentimes in a social network, in the sharing of information. And sometimes the pendulum will swing back and forth between over-compartmentation and kind of perhaps too open, but without a real method to consider in a principled way what is the optimal structure that would minimize risk to the United States, it's difficult to say where we are on that spectrum. And the other thought that I had too was that oftentimes there's this sense that openness and security are anathema, and that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. When I was in graduate school, for example, I took a class in cryptography, and my professor said a counterintuitive thing, which is that the most secure cryptographic systems in the world are the ones whose architecture has been openly published, enabling peer review and to let the nerds of the world look at it for chinks in the armor that could be exploited. Now, the keys have to be kept secret, of course, but that openness in that context is a strength. And there's no reason why we can't learn from that. It's not applicable to every conceivable context. But when it comes to sharing information, there are some unique things that we might be able to do. There's something called a zero knowledge proof, for example, that is manifested in something known as, the simplest form is something called the millionaire's problem, where two millionaires sit across from each other and they want to know which one is richer. And without the use of a trusted third party, they can use an algorithm to calculate the exchange of information, and they can determine which one has more money without actually knowing the other's net worth. And so if we can exploit that kind of a thing, then perhaps instead of directly sharing information, we can do something like that where we can benefit from each other's information without necessarily knowing what it is. Creative things like that.
And what you do with that information. Thank you for that. Admiral Lunde, you work at Cyber Command, which is probably one of the organizations that people have a lot of questions about your capabilities, your powers, what are you doing with your information, sort of in the shadows for a very long time, yet your command has also taken the issue of transparency very seriously. How has it changed what you're doing and how you're doing it since these principles came out?
Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here with this distinguished panel. And to talk about transparency, I think it's a great topic for today's conference. When I think about transparency, and Sean hit on this to some degree, obviously we understand that a government must keep things secret in order to perform foreign affairs and military and intelligence functions particularly, but that there's a balance there that the public needs also to have some level of transparency in order to have the trust in the government and what the government is doing, even if some things necessarily must be kept secret. And I think that balancing is important because it informs a broader balancing, the balance between liberty and privacy on one hand and security on the other. And that just underscores that transparency is a key part of that equation, that understanding and that balancing. And we look for great examples like that. After the media leaks a few years ago, there were some leading voices that were pushing transparency, like Bob here, that were out discussing in a very public way and explaining in a public way and bringing facts to light to bring an informed, to inform the public rather than step back and leave an uninformed public, which wasn't productive. For Cyber Command, it's important because it's not a very new entity, only 5 years old this year, for people to understand what is Cyber Command. And oftentimes there's a confusion because we have close partnerships with other organizations like the National Security Agency. We both share the same boss. Admiral Rogers is the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, also the director of National Security Agency, but we're two different organizations with different authorities and different missions and different people, even though we work very closely together. Cyber Command is a joint military command that reports to U.S. Strategic Command, and it has a military purpose, and it follows from the Department, or it performs the Department of Defense 3 missions in cyberspace. And these are contained in the DoD cyber strategy that was released in June by Secretary Carter. The department's missions are first to operate and to defend the Department of Defense information networks, to protect DoD data and assure Department of Defense missions. The second is to support Joint Force Commander objectives worldwide, the combatant commands, U.S. Central Command or Pacific Command around the world, and when required to integrate cyberspace operations with military operations in all the other domains, air, land, sea, space. And the third mission for the Department of Defense and for Cyber Command is to defend U.S. vital interests and U.S. critical infrastructure against major cyber attacks that are disruptive or destructive in nature. And under those 3 missions, again, because the command is only 5 years old, one of our primary focuses is to develop the capability and capacity for the Department of Defense to perform those missions. And so right now the department is building out 133 teams of the Cyber Mission Force, about 6,200 people, which will be the maneuver elements of U.S. Cyber Command and the Department of Defense to carry out those missions. And we are about the business of training and preparing those forces to conduct those missions. The Department of Defense is only one of the actors from the federal government in this space. Obviously, the Department of Homeland Security has key responsibilities for protection of the federal networks other than the Department of Defense, and ensuring and in supporting the preparedness of the private sector to be prepared for and respond to and recover from cyber attacks. And then the Federal Bureau of Investigation has primacy in this area for investigation and response to cyber incidents that are criminal in nature. So we share responsibility, and so it's important for people to understand that Cyber Command's role fits into a broader federal picture. The final piece that's important, and this gets to the transparency, is the power of partnerships. U.S. Cyber Command is powered by partnerships, not just with those federal agencies, but perhaps most importantly with the private sector. Much of the infrastructure for cyberspace, the IT infrastructure, or even private infrastructure, U.S. critical infrastructure that relies on or is owned by and operated by the private sector. So it's imperative that we have a partnership with them. We do that in different ways, whether it's through training and exercises that include the private sector, or it's our point of partnership that's part of the Department of Defense's presence in Silicon Valley, the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental that Secretary Carter announced in June, a realization that the cradle of innovation no longer resides with the Department of Defense, that it really resides in Silicon Valley, and we need to establish a better dialogue, a transparency and understanding of mutual respect and understanding with the private sector, particularly the IT sector, not just to take advantage of technology innovation, but also to understand how do we recruit and attract talent, how do we train that talent, and then how do we have some permeability between government and the private sector so that we can manage that talent rather than just have it as a stark competition for that talent.
I think a great example of that was perhaps when General Alexander, while he was director of the NSA, had traveled to Black Hat, the conference in Las Vegas where they attract kind of the youngest and brightest hackers and was trying to recruit them, very openly doing so. So that was very interesting as well. Thank you for that. Mr. Litt, you have a very difficult job. So Edward Snowden happened, and then Director Clapper decided we need more transparency. It's not because there were not already oversights in place. There are congressional oversight structures in place to make sure that the people who operate within the intelligence community are following the rules, following the laws, doing things that are appropriate. And then the development of these principles was a little bit of a shock to the IC overall. Would you say that's right?
So first of all, like others, I want to express appreciation for the opportunity to be here at this conference. I also want to note that Director Clapper is going to be speaking later on today. It's usually considered bad form to front-run your boss too much. So whatever I say, Director Clapper is going to say it better later on.
Nice positioning.
Yep. I do think that we've had a real awakening as a result of what's happened over the last 2.5 years. Historically, the issue of classification has been driven by mission needs. I think that sort of the suggestions that there's a lot of classification that goes on to try to protect misdeeds or embarrassment is not something that I've observed, but it is true that the incentives within the intelligence community were to classify things because you were always focused on the bad things that could happen if classified information came out. I think as a result of the leaks over the last couple of years, I think the director has come to the conclusion that in fact, mission need drives transparency as well in two respects. One is the ability to try to ward off some of the both misleading information and serious damage that's been caused to us by the leaks by being more transparent proactively. And two is the fact that in order to do our mission, we need to have the support of the people. And without that degree of transparency, there's going to be an impact on the mission. And we have seen that over the last 2.5 years. There has been an impact. So the director who has a certain amount of authority over classification and declassification across the intelligence community has made very clear that he thinks we need to focus more on transparency for the benefit of the mission. And as you noted, we've issued and published publicly on our websites principles of intelligence transparency that apply across the intelligence community and are working hard on trying to implement them in a concrete way and make them a part of people's fabric in the same way that the classification rules have been. I think there's kind of an interesting parallel here to what happened after 9/11, because internally within the intelligence community, there was a great deal of protectiveness about information and an unwillingness to share. And I think that over the last 15 years, the intelligence community as an internal matter has started to adapt to the idea that instead of focusing entirely on need to know, we need to be focusing on a need to share information as well. And I think we need an equivalent sort of cultural change with respect to transparency so that throughout the community people understand that we need to be more transparent. I think, as a couple of people have commented here, it's important to figure out where the lines are drawn. And I think generally speaking, we have come down with a sort of rough framework that we can be more transparent about legal rules, about the framework in which we operate, about the protections we have for privacy and for civil liberties. What we need to protect is specific methods by which we collect intelligence, specific sources of intelligence, specific intelligence we gather, that those are the things that if released, and sadly they are released and leaked far too often, but those are the things that we have to protect because those can lead to, release of those can lead to compromise of actual capabilities.
Wonderful, thank you for that. There are several things in what you said that I'd like to follow up on in just a moment, but first I'd like to get to Deputy Director Gordon, who you have a very unique vantage point for a couple of reasons. One being you spent the bulk of your career at the CIA, notorious for not wanting to tell people things, right, in the past. And now you are the Deputy Director of an agency who is pushing very hard on the transparency front, but that gathers information that is often helpful when shared with the public, which is slightly different from some of the other people we're sharing the stage with this afternoon. How has the transparency mission impacted NGA in particular, and how do you see that difference?
Well, first, all the information that the intelligence community collects is helpful to the American people. Not just, but all the information,
We'll
collecting it all in. And the other thing is, Bob, while I'm appreciative of your difficulty of preceding Director Clapper, think about my position. Seriously, I have to follow an incredibly articulate boss who says almost everything there is to say, and I have to follow you all who made some incredibly articulate comments about.
I'm confident you'll rise to the occasion.
So I'm thanks, Bob. So I'm a simple girl, and the way I make sense of this is I go back to founders' visions, and if I conflate the CIA's vision and my version of it into the intelligence communities, it's to know the truth, to see beyond the horizon, and to be able to provide the ability for the nation to act before events dictate. And NGA's particular mission is to provide decision advantage through command of geospatial intelligence. So if you think about those two and this moment, you can see what impels us to have to be transparent and to succeed in the open, and there are really three areas. And there will be lots of issues with all the things I'm going to say, contractual issues, data sharing, data protection, but let me hit them. The first is, we're impelled because you have to think about what the issues are and what our customers need. So Robert talked about the Ebola crisis, and we talked about Nepal, and we talked about the Arctic. And if you think about those are serious national security, albeit for very different reasons, issues, that we can provide particular knowledge and wisdom, and because of who we are, we can make that available. So if I'm uninteresting, you can right now go on your smartphone to nga.mil and you can pull up either Geoint Services or the Ebola site or the Arctic site, and you're going to see our data, hundreds of layers, hundreds of products that we can make available. Because why? That's the issue of the day, and the customers that we have need information differently from some other customers need information in some of the more traditional military and national security ways. So we're impelled to go there because that's where the issues are and that's where our customers are, and we have to have impact because why? That's our mission. The second thing is we have to succeed in the open because of where the data are and of how we have to interact with it. Gone are the days where all the information that is going to help us apply our mission is being collected particularly for us. The information that we need is all around us, and we have to be able to use it in order to ply our trade and what the nation pays us to do. So you're going to see NGA do things like have a Pathfinder project that says, I'm going to take a bunch of analysts, I'm going to toss them out into the wild, and I'm going to expect them to succeed on their craft, their wits, and open information. Why? Because I want to learn how to use that. And how we interact with data is different because of where it is. So we're going to be present on GitHub, and we're going to put applications out there on the App Store so that not only are we able to use the data, but the data is going to be able to interact with us in interesting ways. And then the last reason why we must be out there is because of who the people are with whom we need to partner in order to be good at what we do for the nation. Whether that is international partners or whether that's the technologists that you talk of, if we aren't accessible, especially considering the incredibly vibrant community of technologists and online communities who are producing things at an alarming rate that can be combined with our exquisite purpose and their innovation, we have got to be open and accessible. So I think our space, in addition to agreeing with these gentlemen, is in part driven by mission need.
Absolutely. Thank you. Admiral, I'd like to kind of start to drill down into some specific examples of things that the government may not have talked about previously so that we get a sense of what really has changed through examples. And there was something that we had talked about that occurred. It was an exercise that you were a part of that occurred earlier this year that looked at the potential of a cyber attack against the country's critical infrastructure, which is something that's a very viable threat. And you partnered with the private sector in order to run this program. Now, it's a classified program, but you're able to sort of talk about sort of why you're undertaking exercises like that, and that perhaps we need to be doing many more of them. Is that right?
Thanks, Suzanne. It was a great opportunity for the Department of Defense and for Cyber Command to partner with private sector because we share so much ownership and responsibility related to the cyberspace and our reliance on it. And of course, the threats are dynamic and continuous in this area, whether it's Department of Defense information networks, government networks, or private networks that are constantly being bombarded on a daily basis. And so the exercise you mentioned is called Cyber Guard. We've run it, this is the 4th year we've run it. We just finished it in June, a 3-week exercise. And it's co-sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the purpose of the exercise is to test a whole-of-nation response to a major cyber attack that's destructive or disruptive in nature, that third mission of the Department of Defense that I mentioned. And we invited the private sector to participate in that. Representatives from the energy sector, the financial sector, the IT sector, and the transportation sector, as well as our allies. And I put it this way, if you could imagine, let's say there was suddenly there were rolling blackouts began and they were across the country. Just power was disrupted and not reliable. People weren't able to get their money out of ATMs. A major shipping port in the United Kingdom, its commerce was disrupted. It wasn't able to move goods, and so there were bare store shelves. That was the scenario that participants faced. We put teams of government, not only Department of Defense and other federal agencies, but state, the National Guard and private sector teams in a closed, classified computer network, simulating our own networks and the internet, against a live opposing force who simulated a range of adversaries and simulated attacking them, and they had to defend their own networks in this situation and respond to this scenario. Now, this wasn't a prediction or a forecast of what might happen. It's simply a realization that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty out there, and we together have to be prepared using these partnerships for scenarios like that or like the ones we simulated should they occur. But the critical part, this was the first year we brought the private sector to be able to participate, cleared individuals who came through sponsorship of the Information Sharing and Advisory Councils, the ISACs that DHS sponsors, or the Information Sharing and Analysis Organizations. They had clearances and came in through that way. And were able to participate. And we gained as much insight as they did, I think, from being involved in that exercise to understand that they have priorities about business operations that will drive some of their decision making And we need to understand those, and we need to understand how each of us will act in this kind of a situation.
So let me ask you specifically, when you have something like that, an exercise that's an actual classified exercise, how much information can you then share with the public about what we've learned from that and about our posture and whether or not we're ready for an event like that?
So I think so after it was over, we had a discussion with the media, and we encouraged the private sector participants to talk about under the right rules to protect those things that were classified in the exercise that needed to be protected, but the ability to have a discussion. We had the exercise, that what the exercise was about in the scenario that I just described was important so that the public understood what is the Department of Defense and Cyber Command specifically doing with the private sector in this kind of an event. That's important because it lets people know, it reminds them what our mission is in the Department of Defense and Cyber Command, but also that preparedness not only in the government, in the federal, but at the state level and in the private sector is critical to responding to major domestic incidents. I mean, a cyber attack is the one we're talking about, but it's leveraging the same principles and framework, the national response framework, by which the federal, state, government, and the private sector and the public would respond to a major natural disaster or a terrorist attack, for example. And so that importance of practicing, of preparedness, the ability to respond and recover is important to ensure the public's trust and confidence in our ability to do that, and signaling to potential adversaries that we are ready or we're better prepared so that they're aware of that as well, to deter them from taking those kind of actions.
Right. Mr. Litt, let me follow up on that by asking you. I think a lot of this debate is between allowing the intelligence community to do what it was created to do and protecting privacy. So we've seen the creation of, for the first time, the CIA has a Twitter account, right? We're not expecting the CIA to tweet out secrets about missions they're working on, though that would be really cool. What is the proper public expectation of what transparency should mean? As a member of the public, should I be expecting details about these operations, these exercises, how prepared we are? What should my expectation be?
I don't think you can give an across-the-board answer on that. As I said, there's a line that has to be drawn. I mean, intelligence by its nature has to be conducted in large part in secret. You simply cannot publicly advertise, we're targeting these individuals over these communication circuits. We are sending in spies to collect this kind of information from foreign governments, because you then destroy your intelligence capability. At the same time, I do think that it is possible to give the public a general understanding of what we do to protect both privacy and national security. And I think that, generally speaking, we try to avoid the term balance of those two, because I think that suggests that there's an inevitable trade-off that as national security goes up, privacy goes down, and I don't think that's right. I think what we're focused on is trying to find ways where we can both protect national security while still providing appropriate restraints that ensure that people's privacy are protected. And so if I can just give a little specific example, there's been a great deal of controversy for the last couple of years about a program that the NSA had to collect telephone metadata in bulk. And this was one example of something where I think that if we'd found a way to talk about that in advance on our own terms, it would have been much less shocking to people. But I think the important thing about it that's little noted is that program was operated under strict oversight controls by all three branches of government, the judiciary, the Congress, and the executive branch. And in fact, much of the criticism of the program has been along the nature of, well, if the government collects this kind of information, they could use it to do A, B, and C. And the fact of the matter is, none of that happened, because there were strict rules and there was strict oversight. And so that's an example of what I mean by how we can both protect national security and protect privacy. And we need to find ways to communicate to the public how we're doing that, so they have an assurance that we are doing what's necessary to protect the public without unduly infringing on people's rights.
And it's hard not to talk about the congressional responsibility of oversight in this, but we don't have a member of Congress on stage, and we don't want to attack them. Well, maybe you do want to attack them, but not when they can't defend themselves. So, but that is something that's also, I think, very important to keep in context when you're trying to think, it's not like there aren't oversight measures in place. There are, and they're democratically found oversight measures. So we've got some great questions from the audience, so I'd like to go ahead and jump to some of these. And Deputy Director, this might be a great one for you. Will the traditional roles of all source, GeoInt, SIGINT analysis change over time with non-traditional and open source data?
Yeah, I think everything changes over time. And there are days when I'm being probably hyperbolic, and some of the really strict barriers between each type of information, we see them blurring all the time. On some level, it's data, and because the intelligence community, particularly post 9/11, has invested a lot in integration, you are seeing more people use more data sources. And the way I say it is we all have all source thinking, even if we apply particular craft. So I think you're going to see it change over time. It must. Actually, if you listen to each one of us talk, even though we represent different agencies, you hear a remarkable commonality in the challenges that we're facing. We're not talking about the nation's challenges from a narrow discipline perspective, and so I think it will. And I think technology is going to allow us to both protect it and share it. I think we are getting more conversant in using the multiple data types to answer questions rather than just looking at the particular data that we had. So I think you'll see it change over time. But I don't think in a chaotic fashion, and not necessarily one goes away and one strengthens. It's just, it's going to evolve.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another great question, Mr. Weiss, perhaps you'll answer this one for us. Will greater understanding of the IC's role via these transparency efforts make the public less inclined to call every bad event an intel failure?
Good question, Mr. Weiss.
You're right. Having been on either in the middle of or in the margins of various successes or challenges throughout my 27 years, it's hard because what appears in the public domain and in the colloquial parlance as an intelligence failure may in fact be a shortcomings in the amount of information that we have available to us. Back to the previous question, then I'll come back to this question, if I might. The Defense Intelligence Agency is primarily an analytic agency. We do all source intelligence production. And so historically in the past, the culture has been, and I was part of the culture, that the only information that was useful to an intelligence professional was secret information that was by definition intelligence. And then we discovered that out in the real world, beyond the walls of our offices, is this thing called the internet, and it's a wellspring of extraordinary data and facts, information, context, in volumes that are just absolutely astounding. And so now all of a sudden we have the ability to not only have the special information that our respective agencies collect and our respective agencies acquire, but we now also have, as I said before, as our adversaries connect the dots, we have a lot greater ability because we have a lot more dots. Now, a lot more dots create some challenges, particularly in the data analytic domain, but it is very difficult. So in the past, because information was quite limited, we were quite parsimonious because of our ability to collect secrets, and it was only the secrets that we valued. And now the fact of the matter is that we have extraordinarily increased scope of information available to us. So I would imagine that the intelligence community as a whole will produce analyses, assessments, and actually engage in behavior that'll be less likely to produce what we commonly call intelligence failures.
Interesting perspective.
one comment on that. This may get me into trouble, but whoever asked that question, I urge you to ask the same question of Director Clapper when he is here, because he has very interesting views on this issue of what intelligence can and cannot be expected to accomplish.
Managing expectation, again, is an important theme, yeah. Would you like to follow up on that same question from your perspective? Because it's kind of true, as you create more information, you get a whole different set of challenges. So even identifying steps along the way that may lead to that ultimate judgment of success or failure, all of those things are moving pieces, and none of them are easy.
Yeah, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and I think that, at least in the classes that I teach, we have a set of case studies where we look back on Pearl Harbor, the Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War, and one of the things that we do as an exercise is students have to do a case study and evaluate whether it was a success or a failure and why. And oftentimes they start off with something that seems pretty straightforward, like the Cuban Missile Crisis is kind of a canonical intelligence success. People generally consider that to be a success. And the more they dig into that, the more they see the complexity. And they say, well, geez, why didn't we know about the missiles going in the first place? You know, why couldn't we prevent it? Why couldn't we prevented that event before it took place? And so I think that it's almost like anything, that the more you dig into it, the more complexity you see. And I couldn't hazard a guess as to whether this increased openness would result in the public evaluation of our work being, whether there's less of a chance of seeing these events as an intelligence failure. But I think that the education is healthy all around.
Yeah.
Suzanne, one thing on, just as you were talking, I'm really excited about more content and more data. If you're an intelligence professional, this is, it's like wallowing in it. But I think we have to remember that one of the things the American people count on the government for is to be sure, right? That what we say can be trusted. And intelligence failures are notwithstanding, you do want to count on it. And so there is an interesting moment here as we consider all this data, and I could argue statistically that the more data you get, the closer you get to the truth, but this knowing how to manage it so that we don't get a cacophony, but rather, to steal one of my boss's words, we get coherence, is an interesting challenge. And the second piece is, how do we ensure the pedigree of it? Take the simple business that I'm in of geography and cartography, and there is a really exciting possibility that we see going on with OpenStreetMap and lots of data that can help toward mapping. But there are my customers who expect that what I tell you is going to be true. And so interesting challenges to take all this potential and turn it into something that is in fact worthy of the trust that people put in the US government. So I think we have that back-end challenge too.
And I might also suggest that my generation, perhaps maybe a little less facile with a little less facile with the volume of information that's available. But the younger generations, they've grown up with it. And so the value of the younger generations as new apprentice and journeyman employees for any of these fine agencies, extraordinarily valuable, and will be the real engine, I think, that drives us into the future in terms of this data analytics, and how do we turn data analytics into information that's useful to the policymaker.
I agree with that. There's some young people I know in the audience right now who understand the internet and how to use apps far better than I do. So we're running a little bit out of time. We have about 10 minutes left. So I'd like to kind of have an experiment with all of you and engage in an episode of speed dating on this next question. So if I could get you to sort of answer this next question in a minute or so, sort of top of mind, what first comes to mind? Yes, in a tweet, in 140 characters, or you can do more than that now. What are the most worrisome concerns about using open source data in the open against classified national intelligence priorities?
I think I mentioned mine, and that is creating coherence so that we use it to good effect to present a clearer picture, vice one that is more chaotic.
Makes sense?
I think from the lawyer's point of view, it's going to be a question of devising the appropriate rules to ensure, as I said before, that we are providing adequate protections for people's not so much privacy in the context of open source, but civil liberties.
I think it's important that, first, we realized probably several years ago that not everything you look up on the internet is true. And so when we talk about open source data, it's an
Shocking.
appreciation for the fact that, that knowing what the source of the data is, or that information that's out there may be actually used to influence or shape rather than inform in terms of what you may find in open source information. So the ability to apply analytical rigor that Sean described is critically important. The ability to think critically and using structured techniques about information is absolutely essential, and that gets back to human judgment as opposed to just the focus on technology.
Marriage of the two.
Here, he's echoing what I said, so I'll say that more information is not necessarily better. I think it's important when constructing any kind of analytic argument that you know beforehand, if you can, what types of data you could use. There's something to be said for information discovery, inductive reasoning, but there's something to be said for deductive reasoning when you have a principled method to approach a problem and you don't just go for what's available.
I think because as I mentioned, because we now recognize the value of open source information, it's no longer an issue of looking for a needle in a haystack. It's looking for a needle amongst a million other needles, not all of which are real needles, as the Admiral indicated. And so my concern is possibly reach the limits of the human intellect in terms of being able to bring what Sue mentioned as the coherence piece. So our growing dependency upon the artistry of data analytics and the algorithms and the machines that will help bring some of this coherence, and what ultimately is where the machine leaves off and where the human artistry begins, I think we're not there yet. And we're just on the starting end of that journey.
I'd like to retweet his.
You want to retweet his? Okay.
Yeah, that's.
Okay, last speed dating round question here. How transparent is too transparent? I like this question for the IC. And how are we going to know when we've gone too far? Go for it.
I'll stall for you all. Back to my comment before, first principles. We serve the American people. We have to add value. We have to make sure that we are not just trying to be trendy or first or present. And so to me, it's all about holding on to what our job is and using whatever mechanisms. And if we start trying to be transparent for transparency's sake, rather than to better engage, better use, better convey, then I think we will have gone too far. But if we hold true to our values and recognize the world we live in, I think we'll be all right.
I mean, I think I've said it already. I think we know we've gone too far when the transparency has gone beyond enabling a public debate and understanding of what the intelligence community does and how it's regulated, and goes into disclosures at a level of detail that compromise those activities.
Particular missions, for example, or sources or methods.
No, I agree. I think when we talk about the importance of the dialogue and partnership between the government and industry, or the private sector in a broader way, the ability to have that communication informs what the right level of transparency should be. And it's a constant search for that right level.
Constantly moving target as well, right? As the ability of the adversary changes and evolves. That question needs to be front of mind, I would think.
Because I agree with everything that the three of you have just said, I'll say that one nuance of transparency that hasn't come up too much is that transparency is also a function of time. People want to have information immediately, but I think that the intelligence community should get major props for releasing the greatest number of presidential daily briefs ever in one single batch just a few weeks ago. A minute ago, we were all kind of joking about the idea of the agency tweeting secret information, but maybe 50 years from now or something like that, then the reason for its secrecy will be overtaken by events, and that will be possible. So I think that patience on the part of the public is a major part of what drives transparency.
Mm-hmm. Let me just quickly address quite frankly, for me personally, transparency began at a very elemental family level. I was undercover for 27 years. the vast majority of that time, the three sons had no idea.
No idea what Dad did every day.
No idea what Dad really did for a living. I was hardly transparent. But at some point, and it came very starkly to me, when our oldest son came and said, hey, his best friend just came to the realization that his dad worked for CIA. And I said, son, do you really believe that? I mean, why would your best friend transact in such sensitive information? And now, the truth is, his best friend's dad and his mom happened to be undercover officers for the agency.
Wow.
So I asked my son, so it was a bit awkward.
So you said, ask what his mom does?
And I said, son, why would, if that was true, why would he transact that in the locker room, in the team room? And I said, what would make him come to that conclusion? So he walks me through that. And right when he gets to the end of that, he gives me one of these, and for those of you that are parents, look at me with kind of that, I've just connected the dots thing. And so he says, Dad, can I ask you a question? And I said, yeah, if you're prepared for the answer.
Wow.
And
Fun
he
times
said,
at your
he
house.
said, are you or aren't you? And I said, yeah, I am. And he was a stunned mullet. And we talked a little bit about that. And so the transparency piece is what some of my colleagues were saying. And to your point, where is the sweet spot? And so for me as a father with my own son, if I told him too early, he wouldn't have the maturity to handle it. Mm-hmm. But if I tell him too late and he already come to the conclusion and he already knows and believes and he's transacting in this with no rules, then it becomes a hazard to my profession and quite frankly to my colleagues in the business that I'm doing.
It's interesting because it gets back to judgment, right? Whether it's in your
get back
family
to
or whether
judgment.
it's within the intelligence
And I
community.
think to the counselor's point is that there is no real defined sweet spot.
Yeah.
Each individual issue, each individual declaration, each individual thing, enjoys its own sweet spot, and it gets very hard. For the record, as an honor of me telling my son, he gave me this Boris and Natasha tie, which is why I'm wearing this today.
We had to get all the way to the end of the hour to hear the tie story. But it was worth it, right? Wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, in the interest of full transparency, I have promised the attorney on this stage 30 seconds for a commercial. You're up.
So I know Doug did a little recruiting pitch at the beginning. I just want to say I have been fortunate enough to spend about half of my career in the private sector and half of it in government. And for those of you who are students out there, I would just say to you that generally speaking, the worst days in government are more fun and more rewarding than the best days in the private sector. Twice a month, private sector is better when you get paid. But for me, over the course of my career, the time spent serving the public, knowing that you going home every night, knowing that you've spent that day trying to do what's right for the nation, is absolutely inestimable. So I urge you all to consider that kind of career.
Thank you. And I'll just wrap it up by thanking all of you for taking the time to have this conversation. I think this is a very important first step, and mostly thank all of you for coming and for the questions that you submitted. And thank you again for the invitation for the panel.